Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the OPC Web Conference on Managing Performance and Investigations. My name is Todd Wright, and I will be producing this afternoon's conference and providing technical support. Please note the chat pod in the bottom left corner of the screen. This chat area is available on each screen just in case you experience any tech challenges. Let me know any of your basic challenges in that space, and I will help you out. During the conference, there will be some short polls intended to gather your input on a few related questions. Depending on the device you are using today, you may not see all of the poll. If this is the case for you, there will be scroll bars on the right side of each poll if you need to move up or down. The files for the session that were sent out via the email on Friday are also available in the files pod at the bottom right of the screen in case you need to get them if you didn't get them before. And to download those, simply click once on the file name and then choose the download file option. Your presentation team today will be Colin Fleming, Laura Hodgins, and Naeem Sadiq. They will guide you through this afternoon's agenda and will help support your learning today. I'll now turn things over to Laura, and she will introduce and begin the session. Laura, over to you.
Thanks very much, and welcome everybody to our webinar. Here with me today is Naeem Sadiq and Colin Fleming, and they'll be leading the different parts of the webinar as we move along. We'd like to start with our presentation team. And there you see the Ontario Protective Services team with the three of us front and center at the top. We're the Protective Services consultants. And our General Counsel, Sarah Coleman, Anna McDonald, our Legal Counsel, Michelle Soon, our Legal Counsel, and Aditi Syed supports us as our Legal Assistant. So today's case study webinar that we're going to be presenting today, we will be making connections to the Ontario Leadership Framework for School Leaders. And we'll really be highlighting the idea of building relationships and developing people, as well as problem-solving expertise. We're going to be using a case study approach, and throughout the case study, we will be emphasizing these two characteristics of school leaders. The goals of the webinar are up in front of you, and as we work through, we're going to look at different strategies to deal with performance issues and discuss the connection to effective supervision. That will be part A of the case study. Part B, we'll be looking at the factors that prompt investigations and discuss best practices for conducting and responding to investigations. And part C we'll engage school leaders in a dialogue through our case study to develop strategies and gain knowledge that will support them in their leadership role. So as we prepared this case study and the work for today, we do see these two issues as being linked, managing performance and investigations. And as we work through this, we hope you'll see that as well and learn some proactive strategies for how to deal with that. For those of you that like organizers, graphic organizers, we have two placemats that were also sent to you. The first one, the green one, is managing performance, and you may reference that throughout the case study. There are some general guiding questions there, some tips, some references to legislation, as well as a follow-up area on how to close off the issue of performance or how to deal with the students and parents who are involved. On the flip side would be the purple side, which is entitled Investigations. And on this, we've given you lots of tips as well as resources to think about as you're working through an investigation process or if you're responding to an investigation. So those are there for you to use. I'm not necessarily going to reference them throughout the webinar, but they are a takeaway for you that you can organize your thinking as you work through this. So let's start off with part A, and part A is around performance management. This is a key responsibility for school admin. that you are working on building a collaborative culture within your building and productive working relationships that are really geared towards improving the instructional practices that ultimately will benefit student needs. I think one of the things to keep in mind there is the word collaborative, and the idea of building trust is key as you work with your staff. As you work through performance management, it's important to remember that you are to take a positive, supportive approach, that you provide constructive feedback that's timely, that you're proactive in serving as a coach and a mentor to staff, and that you deal with issues as they, before they become really big, that you're working with your team and you're visible and understanding what the challenges are that they face. Thirdly, you need to be specific about issues and coach individuals on how they can improve and grow as an educator. If you're dealing with somebody that has performance issues, make sure that you're providing supports and a realistic timeline that will give the individual a chance to improve. And the last point is really key. When dealing with performance management issues, you must follow up. So you must check up, you must check in, you must, converse with that person and make sure that things are going along a path. I want to also emphasize that when we deal with performance management, we're not limiting that to just something that happens during the appraisal process year. That's every 5 years, and that's quite a long time for people to go without having a conversation on their performance. So this is the idea of effective supervision, that we're having ongoing discussions and providing constructive feedback. And that all of that is done not in that appraiser, judgy kind of way, but rather in a positive, supportive way that's going to be helpful. So when we prepared for today, we wanted to make sure that we had a case study that people could relate to. And for that reason, we've provided it to you both in a secondary and an elementary format. But basically, the two cases will deal with the same underlying issues. So we hope that's helpful to you, and we'll just review the secondary one first. So Mr. Jones is a teacher with 11 years of experience working in the math department at Trillium Secondary School. He's got one section of grade 9 applied math, a section of grade 10 academic math, and he also works in the phys ed department. He has one section this semester. Mr. Jones has had 2 satisfactory TPAs up to this point. He's due for a TPA cycle to begin in September. So the VPs at this school have been receiving complaints from students about Mr. Jones' math classes. There are concerns about his assessment strategies in math. He isn't available for help, for extra help rather. They have noticed that when they walk by the grade 9 math class he's assigned to teach, there are often a number of students absent, and those who are in the class appear to be disengaged. The principal has been receiving calls from several parents with students in grade 10. They are upset about the latest progress report that indicates their student is not doing well. There are complaints about the teacher being unavailable for extra help. The department head, Mrs. Singh, has commented that not all of her department is on board with the teaching the math strategies that have been suggested for applied math. She's teaching 2 sections of applied math herself and is trying to support other teachers with a common approach that emphasizes the concepts present on the grade 9 EQAO test. And Mr. Jones is openly resistant to this approach. So we're going to flip to the elementary school, and you can see that we're using the same names with some changes. So again, Mr. Jones is a teacher with 11 years of experience and teaches core grade 6. Mr. Jones has had 2 satisfactory TPAs up to this point, due for a TPA cycle in September. The principal's been receiving complaints about Mr. Jones's math classes. These complaints are coming from the parents. There are concerns about his assessment strategies in math. He isn't available for extra help. They have noticed that when they walk by the grade 6 class he's assigned to teach, there are often a number of students absent, and those who are in the class appear to be disengaged. The principal's been receiving calls from several parents as well. They are upset about the latest progress report that indicates their student is not doing well. There are complaints about the teacher being unavailable for extra help. Sorry, just a little behind on my slides here. Sorry. The math lead, Mrs. Singh, has commented that not all the teachers are on board with the teaching strategies being suggested for junior math. She is teaching the other grade 6 class and is trying to support the other teachers in the junior division with a common approach that emphasizes the concepts present on the grade 6 EQAO test. Mr. Jones is openly resistant to this approach. So again, you can see the two similarities between the elementary and the secondary case. So we're going to have some polling questions. And here is the first one. Are the issues within the case study performance or behavior? So now you'll see a little box at the bottom and you can put in your answer. Performance or behavior when it comes to Mr. Jones and his approach. I can see people are making up their minds, and we've got answers coming in. And really, when we look at this, we've got 93% of viewers, or 96% are now saying it's performance, and 3.5% saying behavior. I would classify this as performance. There is some behavior embedded in this, perhaps, but really it has to do with Mr. Jones doing his job. So let's move to the next one. Should you call the teacher to a meeting with union representation to address concerns? And again, your polling question is up there for you. A little more split on this one. Interesting. And that's often the way it is when we're dealing with these kinds of situations is, well, some of you are going to say yes, absolutely. Others are going to say no, I don't think we need to at this point. And others are saying it depends. Well, I think the thing to keep in mind here is people do have a right to have a representative at a meeting if this is a meeting that is concerning to them. It's their optic, ultimately, as to whether or not they need support in a meeting. But often, principals and vice principals do have meetings with teachers that are, on the fly, conversations where they're coaching or mentoring or just talking about what's going on in the school. So just to be clear, I think that if the teacher were to want a rep there, that you need to give them that option, particularly if you feel this is taking a more serious tone, or more importantly, if the teacher feels it is. But, I do appreciate that some of you are saying no, because perhaps you had that ongoing discussion with this individual already. There's a relationship there, and these types of conversations are commonplace. It's all about context, really, right? And so I think that's an important thing to note. Is it necessary to document your concerns? And again, we're seeing this one is becoming a little more defined in terms of results, with the vast majority of you saying yes. I would advise you, yes, document your concerns. Anytime you're having a meeting with a teacher, it's probably a good idea, especially if you're raising something that you see as potentially a concern, that you just make a note of that meeting. You don't need to keep really long minutes of this meeting, so to speak, but just having a note beside it of what you talked about, was there anyone else there? But documenting your concerns is an important thing to do and has helped people. Do you need to call HR? I'm really enjoying this polling feature as I see your answers coming in. It's really interesting. And that's not to dissuade you, it's just interesting to see how the group is interpreting the question. So a number of you are saying it depends, almost half of you. And I've got a few people saying absolutely yes, and I've got a few that are saying no. So I think to keep in mind here, you're right, those of you that are saying it depends, it's all about context. Not a bad idea to call HR, especially if you're fairly new to the job and you're fairly new to dealing with managing performance issues, just to make sure that you're on the right track in terms of following the correct policies and procedures. But it's really important not to forecast either, though, that you're thinking you need to a more vigorous step. You're right at the beginning of dealing with a situation, and there's many layers to this, of course. So it's always good to get some backup. Do you need to inform your SO? Okay. I see more people using the depends button this time. That's interesting. Okay, and I think, again, as we look at the context of the case, you're dealing with a veteran teacher, had 2 successful TPAs. There are some issues going on in that classroom, and not a bad idea to get some backup, so to speak, and letting your SO know that there are some concerns. Because after all, if the parents are calling you, they may very well be bypassing you at some point and going to your SO. I just want to, so thank you very much for taking part in the polling part of that. I'm just going to try to highlight a couple of things about this case study. I want you to know that when you're dealing with this type of situation and a veteran teacher, you're probably going to be the first person to raise concerns about his performance, okay? That's often what we hear when we're talking to people in this set of circumstances and what we hear from our members. And you need to be ready for that. If you are challenging what he's doing, that will put him in a defensive posture. And you need to be ready for that and provide that positive, supportive stance. You will want to discuss these parent calls and the issues with his classes because he may not be aware of these issues. So it's important to address them. You do need to identify any underlying issues by having a fulsome discussion with Mr. Jones and hearing his perspective. And it may be that Mr. Jones absolutely wants his union representative there, and that's fine. The union rep can often be helpful in these types of situations. One of the other things to think about as you're working through these issues with Mr. Jones is you need to come up with a plan on how to effectively resolve the issues, pinpoint problems, and identify solutions. And the teacher absolutely needs to be involved in this process and you need to work with that person in a collaborative fashion. In the secondary situation, if you do have VPs that are working with you, work together as an administrative team to determine what issues the principal can address and what issues the vice principals can address. Mr. Jones may need some support in dealing with these parents, but it is his responsibility. Check in with him and see what else you could do in order to help him as he deals with some calls that seemingly are not that positive. What other kinds of help could be provided to the kids in these classes? We mentioned the idea that he's not available for extra help. Do you have study periods or programs available in your school? Is there online help that the students could access? You can't force the teacher to stay later, but perhaps there are other solutions to that idea of providing extra help. And as far as the secondary department head or the lead teacher in elementary, they may need some coaching in how they're working with their colleagues. Maybe there's an abrasiveness to this conversation that's unnecessary, or maybe their expectations need to be, looked at a little differently, so that you can support them in working effectively with their colleagues. Whoops, sorry, backwards instead of forwards here. Okay, and lastly, the tips that we also cover through the polling questions. Always keep notes. Avoid meeting with Mr. Jones one-on-one. Try to have another person in the room to hear the conversations, supporting you and the staff member. Remember that there's a fair amount of emotion that can be tied into these things, so you need to keep your emotions in check, but also make sure that you are being aware of his emotions. Always be professional and maintain neutrality when you're having these types of difficult conversations. Make sure that you're not personalizing the issues, that your body language is open and neutral, that it's not negative. If you have a tendency to pound the table or to slap the table as you speak, try to avoid doing any of those kinds of things. Just stay neutral. Don't put yourself in a position that could lead to accusations against you later. Consider issues of culture, ethnicity, sexuality, identity, gender, and age. And be sure you are being respectful of differences. So that's quite a lot to start off our webinar, and we're now going to turn it over to Colin, who's going to take you through the next part.
Well, hello everyone. So what you can see is that, as Laura explained beautifully earlier, we're trying to take a case study and break it into 3 component parts. You as school leaders all know that any scenario with which you deal as a leader, you're going to have 10,000 component parts. So this is simplifying things to a certain extent, yes. But what we're trying to do is give you a sense of how any kind of scenario with which you deal has the potential to grow into something different and something bigger. So where Laura talked about performance, now you're going to see this scenario morph into something that involves a workplace investigation. The board has the authority and may investigate whether an employee violated a board policy or protocol. Their assessment will determine if, on the balance of probabilities, the employee likely did engage in this objectionable behavior. So remember that much in the same way as how you investigate student behavior matters, when you as a leader investigate staff or the board investigates you, the standard will always be a balance of probabilities. Is it more likely than not that what is being alleged happened or that it is true? So we'll now move on to part B, workplace investigations. Again, we're going to have a secondary scenario and then the analogous elementary scenario with some subtle differences. So as you can see, it's a PA day again. The school improvement team led a PD session. They were looking at grade 9 and 10 credits that were earned by students in the first semester. There were math department meetings during these meetings, or this meeting. Mrs. Singh, who you will recall as the department head, focused her team on the grade 9 and 10 results. During this discussion, Mr. Jones became quite agitated. And you can imagine, discussions between human beings have a whole number of different variances for which people might get agitated. When other members of the team voiced concerns over the grade 9 applied math scores and noticed that his results were noticeably low, Mr. Jones told the team, "This is BS. I don't have to listen to this crap. You can inflate your marks all you want, but kids in my class," just imagine that, my class, "have to do the work." Clearly, if I'm one of the teachers sitting in that room, I might be offended by a comment like that. So let's take a peek at what might come next here. The heated discussion indeed did go on for another 3 to 4 minutes, and it got increasingly louder. Mr. Jones got up. Suddenly, he knocked over his chair, and left the room, slamming the door. So anytime you deal with a scenario like this, I want you to try and paint a picture in your mind about what might be going on in the room and what the behavior might cause as a reaction in other people. Mrs. Singh reported the incident to the principal within 5 minutes of Mr. Jones leaving the meeting. She was shaken and reported that 2 members of her team were crying. But I also want you to keep in mind that simply because 2 people were crying, we can't just assume something about the behavior that caused the crying. It's also the recipients that we have to kind of keep in mind in terms of their personalities. She wants something done as she's tired of working with that man. Similarly, in the elementary scenario, PA day, PD session, within the junior division of which grade 6 is a part, they looked at math instruction and the report card marks from the first term. They also looked at the common assessments which each class was supposed to work through. And it was evident that Mr. Jones was ill-prepared for this learning session. He told the team, again, this is BS, I don't have to listen to this crap, I don't agree with this approach. The kids in my class have to do the work. The heated discussion continued for 3 to 4 minutes, similar to the secondary scenario. He got up, slammed the door, knocked his chair over, left the room. Mrs. Singh again reported the incident to the principal within 5 minutes. Team members were crying. She made the comment, I want something done, as she's tired of working with that man. Okay, so here we go with the poll. You have a sense of what's going on. I've encouraged you to paint a movie scene in your mind. The poll questions will now follow. Do you have to investigate Mrs. Singh's complaint? Already I can see we've got a very strong response. I'll wait just a moment. So nearly 90% of you say yes. Now it's 90. 10% of you say it depends. I will say that Mrs. Singh hasn't filed a formal complaint, and this is where a lot of us get confused. But it is indeed a complaint nonetheless, and so there is an obligation for you as the most direct representative of your employer in that building to investigate. You have to do something with it. So I would suggest that you have to investigate. What investigation looks like in this context may not be as formal as if Mrs. Singh submitted a complaint through, let's say, a workplace harassment policy or something along that lines, but it must still be looked into. There's an obligation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for you to investigate incidents, not just complaints. Folks, second question, can you determine a finding, so that's what really happened, without speaking to both the respondent and the complainant? So I'm really glad to see the results of the poll are almost 100%, because I would certainly say you can't. But I want to be respectful and understand the yeses or the it depends, because despite your best efforts, there may be a situation where you try to speak to one of the parties and they refuse to speak to you. And because your standard to make a decision is on a balance of probabilities, if your best effort met without success, you may need to make a decision at some point based on the information you have at hand, which does not include the testimony, so to speak, of the person who refused to speak to you. So I just wanted to point out that the person who said yes, I don't want to suggest you're entirely wrong, because in a particular situation where you've tried and that person is unwilling to speak to you, you may have to go ahead and make a decision. Of course, I'd be very careful in that case by consulting with your SO and the Human Resources Department. Make sure that you're getting some good advice on how to navigate that type of scenario where the respective union is concerned. but it's pretty clear that almost unanimously people are suggesting that where possible, you want to speak to both parties before making some kind of finding or some kind of decision. Next poll question. Is it necessary to document your investigation? So within seconds, the exclusive answer 100% is yes, and I would absolutely agree with everyone. I'm hard-pressed to think of any situation under which you would not want to document. We always say document is your best friend. You hear in workshops and in PQP, document, document, document. It is not only valuable in your defensibility should you be challenged, but it's just always good practice and always a good idea. So thanks for that response. Can discipline arise from an investigation where the finding is that workplace harassment did not take place? So in a situation like this, folks, the standard or threshold, as we refer to it, for workplace harassment is what it is. A course of vexatious comment or conduct that's known or reasonably ought to be known to be unwelcome. The behavior may not meet that standard, but still there may be some behavior underlying the situation for which there's culpability and discipline should and likely may happen. So I would suggest the answer is yes. If we had more time, we'd flesh out the it depends, but absolutely discipline can arise, even though the findings suggest that workplace harassment did not take place. So in any of these kinds of scenarios, there's always layers and layers of consideration. Complaints of workplace violence or harassment must be investigated. In fact, even if there's an incident of which you are aware for which there's no formal complaint, you still have to investigate. With issues that relate to peer-on-peer incidents, you should consult with your HR department and SO because there are certain factors involving union expectations for their varied members that you want to be mindful of and not navigate through the wrong way. Review the applicable policies and procedures, follow the board's process to the letter. You'll want to interview the parties involved and any witnesses. So we talked about the two parties and making your decision, but oftentimes it's necessary to interview other people. Remind parties that they have a right to union representation. I would suggest you consult with your SO in the case some boards have a historical way of managing things if the person refuses or chooses not to have union representation despite your suggestion. Maintain confidentiality and remind all those involved of this. Be mindful that ultimately there will be a need to repair relationships and restore a respectful workplace. And the more you can do throughout an investigation to not only be mindful of that, but work towards preserving those relationships, the better off you're going to be once everything is finished and all the dust settles. There may be a need for mediation or restorative measures, either by an external person or by yourself as the mediator. I often refer to that as a facilitated conversation. There may ultimately be disciplinary measures depending on the results of an investigation, as we indicated when we answered the polling question. Just got to make sure I know where I am here. And finally, the tips. You'll likely be hearing from the union, folks. Don't be surprised. Always expect this and never shy away from it. Your work as a school leader with the unions will actually be like an investment because it will come back to be of great benefit to you, the relationships that you build. Yes, there will be sometimes when you have to have tough conversations with the union, but as long as you do this in a professional, respectful manner, you hopefully should be okay. And of course, if you don't think you will be, we're here and you can call us and you can certainly consult with your superiors. You're obligated to investigate incidents of workplace harassment. We talked about that one, and I talked about the reference in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And as much as it sounds like we are being repetitive, this cannot be emphasized enough. Always consult with your SO and HR. It can never hurt to do so, and it can certainly hurt should you not do so. We'll now move on to Part C, responding to investigations, and I'll turn you over to my colleague Naeem Sadiq.
Thanks, Colin. Hello, everyone. My name is Naeem Sadiq. I too am a protective service consultant, and it's my pleasure to join you today. And I'll be leading you through Part C of this webinar, responding to investigations. As an administrator, you are responsible for your own actions and omissions, and for those of the individuals under your supervision. So we recognize how difficult a job all of you are in. We understand the stresses that are out there, and the communication and performance concerns may not be well received by staff. So one of the things we're dealing with quite a bit is, as a result, you may become the target of a complaint from an individual, staff member, or their union. So in this case, we're going to run through an example where that's happened. We do recognize how challenging it is when you're doing your job and doing the things you need to do in order to deal with performance. People are often confused or accused of harassment. And that's our role to support people through that. We can say that, generally speaking, we find that these processes show that our members have not harassed people, in fact, are doing their job. But you can see in this case we're about to read, the threshold for a board to investigate would be that, if true, would it be harassment? So you can see in this case, the P receives a call from the SO, indicates there has been a workplace harassment complaint filed against the P and the VPs. Mr. Jones claims that they have been harassing him by visiting his room without notice, calling him into the office regarding parental issues and student issues. He feels has been unnecessarily scrutinized as they have been asked to seize assessment records. He feels the admin put Mrs. Singh up to the idea of publicly embarrassing him at the PA day. Mr. Jones had a meeting with the P following the PA day and claims that the P told him he is lazy, uncooperative, and a disgrace. The P raised his voice to Mr. Jones and pointed his finger in his face in an aggressive way. Mr. Jones was not given the opportunity to have a union rep present for this meeting. He also feels that because he is scheduled for a TPA in September, the P is out to get him. The P is assigned to home until investigation is concluded. He's warned that the entire situation may be confidential and they should call OPC for support. So you can see in this claim, the allegation is sort of marked aside, because that's the point. If true, you can see how harassment would have occurred. It's probably quite clear in the rest of it, the admin team is just doing their job. And just because there's an investigation doesn't mean people are assuming it's true, but it does require people to look into it. Just like in the previous case, you have an obligation to look into potential harassment, so does your superiors at the board level. In the elementary case, it's actually pretty much exactly the same, and we've spelled it out because we do find these situations are very common in both panels and don't really play out that differently as far as process. But this particular case is exactly the same, so I'm not going to read it, but you can be rest assured, regardless of panel, it does relate to you. So now we're going to go into our performance appraisal poll. And the first question is assigned to home a form of discipline? And I'll give you a chance to answer that. And as a large majority, you have said no, because I always remind people who are in these scenarios, many of you yourself have perhaps had to let teachers know, or supervising staff members, and told them they're assigned to home because of an allegation. But recognizing it is not a form of discipline, we still have to remember in a humane way how difficult it is, how stressful it is, and how it feels like somebody has done something wrong. But in itself, it's not a form of discipline, and it does not mean anyone is guilty of anything just because they're assigned a home. Next polling question. Can discipline arise from an investigation where the finding is that the workplace harassment did not take place? So if you want to answer that one. And again, large majority of you, similar to the conversation that Colin had with you, you can see it is possible that discipline can occur even though a workplace harassment did not take place. We're working hard at OPC to work with all the school boards to make sure in their processes that go through investigations that the scope remains around the harassment. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, because if something is uncovered that is concerning and that is problematic, it could lead to discipline. But obviously, we would be there supporting you to do our best to keep the investigation tight on what the allegation is, as opposed into something that in a broader way. But if something does come up that the board has to respond to, they're within their rights to do so. Next question. If the allegations are widely talked about on social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., can Mr. Jones launch a defamation suit? So in this situation, again, depends being the strongest answer coming through. Defamation is a very complicated thing. In order for there to be defamation, there has to be proved to be real damage to someone's character, there has to be intent proven, and it has to really tie back to somebody's actions. If those things can be proven to be true, that somebody did launch something in a false way and it has led to that damage of someone's reputation, it is possible. But for the most part, a lot of times people chatter. Difficult as it may be, it does not necessarily get tied to defamation. Responding to investigation. Things that we want you to really keep in mind here. Whenever you're called to a meeting, please involve OPC. These meetings or investigative can be stressful, and it's really our place to be there to support people through them. Later on, if we were to challenge the decision made, not happy with an investigation, don't think it was handled fairly, and ultimately a decision to discipline if we don't think it was fair, it's difficult to do that if we're not involved from the beginning of the process. Consider the allegations and be prepared to respond to each one. Sometimes there are comments and quotes that you have to think back on. Sometimes we advise people that, if you did say something and you do understand that it's something that may not have been received properly, but you have the opportunity to talk about context, what you actually meant, what was actually said, because many times in these harassment allegations, things are taken out of context and only partial information is given. You do have the right to bring any supporting documentation, notes or emails, etc. In fact, and you could also, even when investigations are over, as a part you remember something and you want to go back and get it, all investigators will allow you to retrieve that and send that information to an investigator. It's very important to answer all questions honestly. We have to remind people that often the allegation of harassment may lead to discipline, but being dishonest during an investigation will for sure lead to discipline, and quite often in a much higher way than even the original allegation would have. And you will get the opportunity to list the witnesses that you'd like to be spoken to about your conduct and about the investigation. People are sometimes reminded, though, it doesn't need to be a full character support about how good somebody is. People struggle sometimes. You could be very strong in your job, but still in one occasion be guilty of harassment. It's really around the incident itself and all interactions that could help the investigator figure out if that occurred or did not occur. So When completing investigation, if there is a finding of fact meeting, bring your OPC representative. That representative will be there taking notes, allowing you to answer questions. Representative will help you prepare. Some investigators like to have written submissions. Others don't, but even still, it's recommended that you get something ready in writing to help you understand what it is you're going to say. You should not be surprised in the interview. You should have everything in front of you going in, and we would help there to make sure that happens. Those allegations will come back to be either substantiated or not substantiated. And that's pretty much all the investigator will actually do. They may or may not give some information around context. They may call something a conflict versus a harassment, but for the most part, what they'll do is let you know. If they'll let the investigator will then take the report and give it to the board, superintendent, or HR, and just say that there's been substantiated or non-substantiated findings. If there is a disciplinary action, it would happen after the finding of fact meeting. So many times the process will go through the interview first. There will be a wait of time for that report to be done. You may be called back a second time if there's details that the investigator needs. And then at another meeting, there will be results given. And perhaps at that point, there will be a break and then discussion of discipline or a separate meeting. And then we recommend at this point you talk to your superintendent about your return to school, and in a way that allows you to sort of feel comfortable. And then all issues that may come up that allow for messaging to be on the same page. So overall, we recognize, I'm just going to head back a bit, overall we recognize that the whole investigative process and harassment process is quite stressful and quite challenging for all members. We recognize the legislation that's led us here, and we do believe that it's our job from an advocacy standpoint to work with boards to keep working on the processes that are there so they remain humane, fair, and be timely. Some boards are struggling with it, and we're working with them to improve that, and others we think are doing a fairly good job given what their responsibilities are. We also work with locals to communicate with their boards around how to best do that. But the one message we want you to take away is that you're never going to be alone through this process, that you should pick up the phone and work with OPC. As stressful as it is, most people come out of it at the other end feeling that they were treated fairly, and they recognize that they had to do their job and find themselves going back to their processes, knowing where their boundaries were and where they didn't cross them. They know that they can go back and deal with supervisory issues in a way that they feel confident. So with that, just so you know, these slides will be made available to you, and this webinar will be available on our website as well. And we do appreciate everyone joining us. We hope that everyone has learned something from it and had some perspective that is helpful for them. And we would appreciate your comments and feedback as we continue to develop PD around this issue and any other issues that may come forward. One other issue that my colleagues wanted me to sort of touch upon that hasn't been addressed yet is one of the difficult challenges that you're going through when you have a investigation is the notion of confidentiality. It's very important that when you go through an investigation, you really talk to nobody about it. And the only people you should be connecting with is your OPC support. It's important for the investigator to know that whoever they speak to during an investigation, their words, their thoughts are their own. This can be very challenging for people, particularly if they're on admin teams. It's not uncommon for us to have a principal go back and chat with their vice principals and say, hey, guess what's happened? Let's go over our notes and get ready for the investigation. And that in itself is actually something that would be considered collusion and breaking of confidentiality. It makes sense that someone would be speaking together, working together during a case, during managing someone's performance issues. But once you know an investigation begins, it's important that you not speak to each other. Thereby, if an investigator shows up to talk to anybody, they know that their thoughts and their wishes and their feelings are their own. They're independent. The last thing you want to do is to talk to one of your best witnesses, and now no longer will their testimony be considered credible, because it may give the impression that you coached them. And again, during these things, you would be reminded by your OPC rep and by the board, but something you should take away for yourself, because the last thing you want to do is make things worse for yourself by breaking confidentiality requirements. So with that, I think I'm just going to wrap up now, and again say thanks to everybody for joining us. The slides will be made available to you, and we hope they were useful. And like I said earlier, we do appreciate all feedback, and hopefully you'll join us on any future webinars that come from OPC.
And on behalf of the team, thanks for joining us today. Thanks to Colin, Laura, and Naeem for leading everyone through the presentation. As indicated, things will become available in the coming days. An email will be sent out from the team regarding how you will be able to access that. So as you leave the room, feel free to hang around for a few minutes and download any of the files that you may need. And when done, simply log out of the room or close the Adobe Connect window. Thanks very much. Have a great day.